Okay, so there was a conversation on the Pathfinder 2e subreddit recently
Okay.
where somebody essentially asked the question, do you get to have weapons out while exploring, or do you need to use an action at the beginning of combat to pull weapons out?
Right.
If you're a listener of our show, you know that for the first chunk of episodes, I demanded that players use actions to draw weapons. This is something that I did in the year 2021. It's currently 2025. I did it for a while. I saw that it wasn't working, and I made an adjustment, and I changed it. There was commentary on this Reddit post about so this person's essentially the original poster was asking do you get to have weapons out? Do you not get to have weapons out? And then people come into the commentary because it turns out that this original poster or their GM has been listening to our podcast and has been getting questionable input from a rules issue that we did wrong. And people are talking about the GM is insistent that things go this way. The GM is very strict about this. I just want to say this was a rules mistake that I made in 2021. It was wrong. You, in my opinion, you do not need to spend an action to draw a weapon at the beginning of combat. There is a presumption in this game that when you're in dangerous situations, that you have your weapon out. This is an idea that I have internalized. I think it's the correct way. I think it's the way that the game is meant to be played. I think it's the intention of the game's design. So I just want to say, first off, this thing where it's we are in the unfortunate position of creating confusion for people in their home game is something that I kind of want to address. And I want to try to articulate why it is that we made that mistake, why it is that I made that mistake, because I think it's an interesting sort of look back at how to interpret rules. And I also just want to clip this part of the conversation out and put it on YouTube so that the next time this comes up and people are like, this guy's an asshole who says that you have to draw your weapon out. Now I have a thing I can point people to being let me explain to you why I was an asshole about that. Okay. I just want to iterate again. I was wrong. You don't need to use an action at the beginning of the combat to draw your weapon if it's believable that you'd have your weapon out. But I want to talk about why I made this mistake. One, and Armet, feel free to chime in at any point. Okay, we started doing this podcast after we moved our home game, the game that Armet and I play in, from 5e to PF2. This game is very different from 5e, but it's very similar to 5e in terms of its thematics and the fact that it's a combat-oriented D20, TTRPG. So because of the fact that the rules are very different, but the themes are very similar, we really wanted to get super buttoned up so that there was not any confusion about what it is how does the things work. The game is very tightly balanced, which was a huge draw of the game for our table. The idea of we can reliably have interesting and fun combats was something that everybody in our home game expressed interest in. And so we did a very strict reading of the rules, a very rigid interpretation of how things work. This game Pathfinder 2 encourages you to think about what are my hands doing in a way that never came out in D&D 5th edition. And I also just want to say that at the time that we were learning this game, it was sort of a different game in terms of its rules regarding items, hands, and so on. When Pathfinder 2e first came out, there was a lot of conversation about bandoliers. In order for you to have an item sheathed on your body, you needed to have specifically a bandolier that you spent a copper piece on, right, so that every single object on your body was accounted for with an item that also goes on your body to hold it in place on your body.
Totally,
there isn't a errata in and pouches and bandoliers and
yeah.
stuff, right? That went away pretty early in the game's lifespan and was replaced with this idea of you can wear a certain number of tools on your body at any time, and you are just assumed to have sheaths and bandoliers for weapons and things like that. But I just want to say that at the beginning of this game's lifespan, there was, especially for somebody coming from 5th edition, there was this idea of hands, sheaths, weapons, all this stuff. It was very central to the differences between the games that we were coming from and the game that we were going to. So that led to certain interpretations of rules. Okay. Yeah. As mentioned in this Reddit conversation, there is a defend activity, the exploration activity of defend, where you can save the action to raise your shield by just having your shield out while you're defending. You are prevented from like searching while defending. If you have your shield up, you're prevented from investigating or doing any of the other exploration activities, barring like feats that let you do multiple exploration activities at the same time. But there is this like idea of, in order to raise a shield, you need to take an exploration activity. There is no exploration activity that involves having a weapon ready, but it does take a action to draw a weapon. So that is something that led me in interpreting these rules to decide incorrectly that like you got to use an action at the beginning of combat to draw an item, just like you'd have to use an action to raise your shield. It's just that there is no way to have your weapon out because there is no such exploration activity. That was the interpretation. I also thought that this was baked into the game's balance because there are unarmed attacks that are weaker than weapon attacks. And I thought that it was an aspect of balance that you'd get to use unarmed attacks. Like if you're a lizard folk and you have claws or a tail or a bite attack or whatever, that like one of the advantages of building your character around unarmed attacks is that you trade off certain like good things that weapons can do in exchange for being able to get started quicker. Nowhere in the rules does it say this, but this is something that I internalized and invented and just lived inside of in my mind. So that was another reason I reached this conclusion. There are also feats like Quick Draw, which let you in a single action draw a weapon and attack with it. And I thought that that was balanced. Those feats were balanced with the expectation that you could take those feats to get a tactical advantage, to get out early and like start your first round by attacking with your weapon. My understanding of how this game worked, based on all of these like misinterpretations of rules, and again I was wrong, was like the first round of a fight is the round where everybody preps and gets ready. The first round of a fight, the first round of a combat is people get their weapons ready. People move to the positions that they want to be in. People with unarmed attacks get to like capitalize on that by rushing forward and biting. People with quick draw get to do a similar sort of thing. So in my mind, the game was just balanced around a first round of preparation, unless you invest in options that let you end around that. And then in future rounds, you use the weapons that you have drawn.
Yeah. Honestly, that makes total sense to me.
It's an idea that came from a game design thing. I didn't think that it was realistic that you would not be able to have a weapon drawn, but I thought that the idea of like, maybe you're walking around with like a weapon in your hand, but in order to get it ready to fight with, you spend an action to like pull it up and get into a stance or whatever.
Right.
I just assumed that this was like the intention of the rules because of all of these different sort of ideas that I'm trying to lay out here. I will say that when you're doing a podcast of a game like this, you really want to get everything right. And I feel as though the people who like our show are so nice and so generous that they like let me get away with this wrong rule. People were like, I'm not sure about this. And I would respond back being like, this is why I think this is right. And people would be like, okay, I respect your opinion. And then it would like go away. And that's something that I'm very appreciative of. I think people are like very gentle in the moment. And then it leads to situations where 4 years later, it's like, that guy's a jerk who says it was an idea of, this is a game with very specific rules. We're going to play the game the way that it's meant to be played, following those rules. And then we're going to tell the story that following those games rules, like that game's rules leads us to. Totally. So that means that we're going to have combats where people are getting ready for a round. We're going to, and that just seems to be the kind of story that this game tells. For people who don't have that perception of game design or of role-playing game design, where it's like the rules are there to support what it is that your fantasy is of what it is that you should be able to do, they bump up against the idea of like, it doesn't make sense that you can't have your weapon out. Why couldn't you have your weapon out? Right. Like the game is meant to bring the fantasy to life. Whereas I often have an approach where it's like the game is meant to be fun, and then you develop a fantasy around the fun that you're having, kind of. But I was wrong. And I just want to articulate, these are the reasons that I reached the conclusion that I did. Don't be like me. Let people walk around with their weapons out if that's the way that it is, right? We shifted, I think, I did a very strong pivot, I think, in this ruling. Like, anytime now I get questions of, like, do I have my weapon out? Like, I'd say yes 9 times out of 10, unless it's like your hands are busy dragging a body, or like you just opened a door, or like you're sitting at a cafe just hanging out, like.
Unless there's situational reasons to say, like, you need to respond in the moment and have to draw a weapon or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll say that the game is way better. It's way simpler just to do that. Everybody's happier. You don't need to fight against player expectations nonstop. You don't need to be wrong on the internet over and over and over again in order to do that. So that's how it is that we run the game now. That's how it is that I recommend everybody run the game. Do the right thing that is normal rather than the weird thing that is wrong.
Sounds like a strong pitch. I'm going to be honest. But I totally do the same things. Like, as you listed the key points, like, there is and I think we actually had a similar sort of conversation about Feather Step as we were both learning the rules of the game. And I was like, Feather Step, nobody's ever going to want to take Feather Step as a general feat. Like, being able to step in difficult terrain, that's so situational, not realizing that, like, yes, exactly. It's good. It's situational. It's like, it comes up a little bit maybe in certain events, but also, maybe it doesn't. Maybe take breath control, arguably one of the better general skill feats.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, anyway, I think sometimes you just have to jump into the game and then see how it runs to sort of get a better picture of it, is how I'd say. Like,
yeah, the part of it that I resent is, like, the way that the conversation is being treated now. Like, this dude's strict, this dude says no to his players all the time, because it's like, I don't think that that's the case. It's just that I interpreted the rules of the game wrong. It's just that I got the rules wrong. It wasn't meant to punish players. It wasn't meant to be strict. It's just that, like, I thought that's how this game was. Is it strict to say in chess that the knight goes up 2 and over 1? Am I being strict in saying no? It's just that that's what I think the rules of the game are. I wasn't doing it to, like, punish people or to be a jerk. It's just that, like, oh, this game has this design space built around it costing actions to get weapons ready unless you invest in options that speed those things up. I just thought that that's what the game was. I want to tell you now, that's not what the game is. So don't run the game that way. Don't be like me.
I think
Thank you.
A powerful lesson.
Yes,
right there.
a powerful lesson. Don't be like me. Thank you for joining us for this conversation.